When I teach, I'm a skeptic. When I'm sort of relaxing, I'm an Epicurean. And when I want to mortify myself, I'm a Stoic.
The exact things that the ancients thought would bring happiness, today we think brings dissatisfaction.
People sweat in the sun. No, says Pyrrho, Alexander's butler, he shivered in the sun. he sweated in the cold. When we exist, death is not there, and when death is there, we're not there. Eastern philosophy and religion may have impacted Greeks. Why is Epicureanism, why is Stoicism so popular today? He's actually at the end of his life. But the pleasure of our conversations and the memories of our times together is enough to counterbalance that. It's a beautiful saying.
Stoicism, Skepticism, and Epicureanism are known together as Hellenistic philosophy. And what I find most compelling about these schools is their focus on the good life. Now, modern philosophy so often veers into useless speculation and pointless questions about meaningless things, but Hellenistic philosophy is just laser focused on happiness. How do I be happy? How can I live a worthwhile life? These are the kinds of practical questions that Hellenistic philosophy bothers itself with. My guest today is a pioneer of the field, the legendary Anthony Long. Professor Long will teach us what happiness consists in for each of these Hellenistic schools. And I think the most surprising insight I took away is how the very things we despair of, the ancients think bring about happiness. So for example, atomism, right? This idea that the world is nothing but atoms buzzing in the void, it creates great distress for many people today. But the Epicureans prescribe atomism to free people from the worry of divine punishment. So for them, materialism is not a cause of nihilism as it is for us, but it's a cause of happiness. Now, another one of these crazy 180s is how the skeptics believed that a foundational doubt, right, a fundamental suspension of judgment on the most important questions about the world, is not a hindrance to, but the secret to happiness. What I loved about all of these odd proposals for the good life is how they've challenged my own fundamental assumptions I held around happiness, and I hope they'll do the same for you. If you want to follow along this episode via transcript, or if you want to be invited to one of my lectures, then please join my email list at jonathanb.com. Without further ado, Anthony Long. Could you tell us a bit about what Hellenistic philosophy is?
Hellenistic philosophy developed after the death of Aristotle not just in Athens, but in other parts of the Mediterranean world. And it's called, and Hellenistic is just a modern term of art to capture this sense of a Greek civilization that had spread far and wide, into Egypt, south, into the east, where we call Turkey today. We should talk about Hellenistic philosophies, because although the ones we'll be talking about are Stoicism, Skepticism, Epicureanism, Pyrrhonism, there were others besides. It was an extraordinary time. It was probably the period in the history of the world when philosophy was sort of most diffused, partly because it covered what we might call today higher education, but also because the philosophies were always competing with one another. And part of what makes the period exciting and philosophically rich is challenges. I mean, so hedonism on the one hand, Stoicism on the other, are very much at loggerheads with each other. The skeptics denying that anything can be firmly known. Stoicism and Epicureanism both arguing that there are criteria of truth. We can establish things for certain. And so we have this very rich period, but unfortunately, it's a little bit like the tip of an iceberg, because most of what was written at that time has perished. Whereas we have the works of Plato and Aristotle, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and the other ancient Hellenistic philosophies are mainly recovered in sort of quotations and summaries. And so part of what's been exciting for me and others like me who work on this is trying to reconstruct the arguments and doctrines which were, are not available to us in a full sense.
One uniting theme among the three schools seemed to be that they offer competing answers to the question, how do we live the good life, eudaimonia. So can you tell us a bit about this goal?
Yes. I think the starting point here is probably to go right back to Socrates. Early Greek science had not much to do with how to live. Socrates was the Athenian figure who, as this sort of street philosopher who went like to challenge people and ask them what they thought about things, and really sort of put on the map the idea that there is something we could call a good life, which was something that could be rationally examined and argued for, and so Socrates, of course, was not no kind of dogmatist. He'll try out the idea of hedonism as a philosophy, or skepticism. I mean, a lot of what become the Hellenistic philosophies have their kind of roots in the embryo in Socratic ideas. Philosophy could become a kind of guide to living, and so with the catchword being this word eudaimonia meaning literally having your sort of divinity in a good shape, but it turns out to be sort of best understood as something like a successful life.
Right.
I think I say successful because one doesn't want to moralize it too much. It's a good life, but it doesn't mean good in a kind of purely Kantian ethical sense.
Right.
A life in which you feel, your own life would be described by other people, as well as yourself, as having been worthwhile.
Right, flourishing. Well lived.
Flourishing, well, yeah.
Right.
Well-being is often translated.
Let me give you a quote from your book. The influence of Plato and Aristotle has proved to be more profound and persistent, but in the widest sense, less pervasive. Everyone has some notion of what it means to be Stoic, skeptical, and Epicurean. What I think is very interesting there is we have a notion of what it means to be these three things.
Yes.
Because we think about them primarily as ethics,
yes.
as philosophy of ethics.
Yes.
But in your book, you actually argue that that's a misconception, that ethics isn't the only or maybe even sole focus of these schools.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Epicureanism and Stoicism have a kind of comprehensive outlook on the world. I mean, they involve science. They involve, especially in the case of Stoics, they involve a very great deal of logic, which, can be applied to how to live, but logical theorems and propositional calculus and all those kind of notions are things we would like to study for their own sake. The Stoics would argue, of course, that really what you're trying to do as a Stoic is you're trying to maximize your potential as a rational being. And of course, mathematics, logic come into that centrally, and so. But I think what's special about Hellenistic philosophy, although of course you've got the vestiges of it already in Aristotle and Plato, is the idea that you're sort of choosing a particular set of goals and strategies to make your life worthwhile, at all times. I mean, it's a much broader conception of the good life than Aristotle. Aristotle has, thinks of contemplation, studying metaphysics, studying the sciences. Those are all very worthwhile things, but he doesn't package them together as part of ethics. Aristotle sort of thinks of his curriculum as quite detachable. I mean, you've got the parts of animals, you've got the study of plants, and so he's beginning to kind of compartmentalize study. Right. Whereas at some level, Epicureanism, Stoicism have a kind of comprehensive package.
I see. So maybe this is another way of what you're trying to say, which is that for Aristotle, even though he recognizes the virtue of contemplation to be one of the highest virtues and to be a possible foundation of a good life, it's not that you have to study his physics or the biology that he does.
Right.
Whereas what's unique about these three schools is that their logic and their physics, studying them is constitutive to the good life.
Yes.
So even though they
right.
are not ethics only or ethics central, the ethics is first philosophy. Maybe we can put it that way. Ethics is first philosophy in the sense that it leads to why the metaphysics and the logics and the physics is important.
Yes, I think that's right. Since we're talking about comparing Plato and Aristotle, and to help us to get a sense of what Hellenistic philosophy is all about, one aspect of Aristotle, of course, which is central, is the notion that his philosophy, especially his ethics, is designed for the small polis community.
Right.
And Aristotle thought that an ideal community should be quite small. It's, people should almost be, everybody should know each other. And the Hellenistic world, of course, with the diffusion of Greek culture after Alexander the Great's conquests, then develops a much more cosmopolitan outlook.
Right.
And that's particularly important for Stoicism, I think.
Right. And let me give you a quote on your book that I think captures this point. The early Stoics, Skeptics, and Epicureans were supremely confident that a man's inner resources, his rationality, can provide the only firm basis for a happy and tranquil life. The city, this is your point, recedes into the background, and this is a sign of the times.
Yes.
So compared to Plato and Aristotle, the idea is that the ethics is no longer polis-driven. It does become cosmopolitan in the sense that you say, but in the same move, it also turns more inward as well.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So the notion of the inner life, which is, has a huge bearing, of course, upon how you behave in the world.
Right.
But there is a kind of introspective aspect to it. And the way Epictetus begins his very first essay, where he says, there's only one craft that can not only study a field, like, say, music or cobbling, but can also examine itself, and that's reason. And reason in Stoicism is also something like the self, the conscious self. It is what you are in your own introspective, reflective, dialogical mode. Yeah.
Right. Let me ask one last question before we actually dive into each of these three schools, which is, what are the geopolitical, social, historical backdrop, and what is the circumstance behind the Hellenistic era that led to this ethics elevation as first philosophy, including this cosmopolitan turn?
Okay, good. Yeah, when I started my work, there was a kind of cliche that Stoicism, Epicureanism especially, perhaps Cynicism too, were sort of they were back to the wall kind of philosophies, that the polis had lost its rationale.
Alexander conquered the known world, right?
And people were, were lost and desperate for some kind of foundation. I think that's not true. I think if you look at the life of Zeno and what we know about Epicurus, they were living in a very prosperous time. The Hellenistic world actually was quite prosperous. So although there's no doubt at all that these are philosophies which offer in some sense some kind of what you might call salvation, but it's not because the outer world was all gone to hell.
Right.
It's rather an additive, but at the same time, an interest in politics for its own sake. I mean, the kind of books like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, philosophers are not writing those kind of books now. It's as if they're much more interested in a kind of ecumenical. I think ecumenical with a way, the word to use. They're interested in society, but they're interested in society not so much in a power politics sense as just how to organize your families, how to organize your friendships, all these notions. Yeah.
So you mentioned what social political forces did not influence Hellenistic philosophy, right? Clearing the ground. But is there something to be said about the actual real historical changes that led to these philosophies? Or should we read the philosophies as sprouting merely on the ideas level?
What we're talking about here, we talk about the beginning of Hellenistic philosophy, say the time at the end of the 4th century BCE. And then we go on right up, for another 2 centuries into the Christian era. So we've got about 5 centuries of philosophy. And during that period, Greece losing its independence, Rome taking over, other communities. I mean, Carthage, for example, which had great problems with the Romans, but two of the great academic skeptics were Carthaginians, North Africans. So there's a diffusion of philosophy. In the Roman world, again, because it's an autocratic world, so there's no scope for individual political autonomy. But of course, that doesn't mean that the philosophies don't touch on politics. But Epictetus, although he's visited by prominent Romans, there's virtually no political discussion in Epictetus or in Seneca. And what's interesting there is, of course, one of the great Roman Stoics is an emperor, is Marcus Aurelius. But he doesn't talk about, the day-to-day politics.
I see.
It's again much more internal.
So let's actually dive into each of these three schools.
Yes.
And let's begin with Stoicism. And we're only going to give a brief summary here, not because there's so little to talk about, but because there's so much to talk about. And we're going to do a separate interview just on Epictetus. But with that in mind, can you tell us a bit about the history of Stoicism? Who are its main leaders? There's a middle, there's an early, there's a late period. Just give us an overview.
Yes. I mean, it's customary, as you've just mentioned there, to distinguish three phases in Stoicism, a kind of creative early phase, 3rd century, 2nd centuries BCE. And this is the period when the school, under its various leaders, is developing its primary doctrines.
Right.
Under, the principle, the founder of Stoicism is a Cypriot called Zeno of Citium. And Cleanthes is another, he was born in Assos. And then the third of the great early Stoics is Chrysippus. And he really should be a much bigger name than he is. I mean, most people haven't heard of Chrysippus, but he was the greatest ancient logician after Aristotle. And he's closer to modern propositional calculus in a way that Aristotle's logic is a very different kind of logic. And Chrysippus dealt with all aspects of Stoicism, but he was especially a logician.
Right.
And people most people just heard of Stoicism, they don't think of logic at all. Whereas Epictetus, as we'll see, has to often warn his students, don't get just caught up in logical theorems as if that's the good life.
Right. That shows just how dominant logic was at the time.
So it's very academic in that sense. So Stoicism starts off with this character called Zeno, who migrates from from Cyprus to Athens. He probably, we don't know much reliably about his early life, but he almost certainly encountered Socrates, probably by reading Plato and Xenophon and so Socrates really is a key figure for Stoicism, and we can think of Stoicism as a kind of application of Socratic ideas with a level of cosmology, which Socrates was not interested in cosmology. He rather deprecated physics. He thought we should just focus on the good life of the human being, whereas we'll want to say quite a bit, I think, about Stoic cosmology is very, very important, and their theology. So early Stoicism then, with Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, takes us down into the 2nd century BCE. And then, these philosophies get diffused into the Roman world. And then when we get into the Roman world proper, into the Roman Empire, the creative phase of these philosophies, in the sense of developing new doctrines, has rather sort of come to an end. And so the Stoicism that people know about, because we can read the Roman books, that's making the Stoic theories available in application to everyday life. So what everybody knows about. I mean, I think the sort of trying to overcome anxiety, overcome fear, dealing with your passions. That Stoicism is very much the Stoicism of the Roman Stoics. How far the earliest Stoics were concerned with therapy in this kind of sense is hard to say, because we just don't have enough of their books.
I see.
The impetus is clearly there, but I don't think we shouldn't think of early Stoicism as primarily a kind of therapy. I think we should think of it as a way to try to try to be at home in the world. Meaning by that, you need to understand quite a lot of what the ancients called physics, not perhaps our modern physics, but causality. I think Stoicism is the first major philosophical scientific theory which believes that causality is complete. There are no random events in Stoicism.
Determinism.
Everything is in principle caused. Doesn't mean we can understand it. So we can talk about chance, but chance is just a name for an undiscovered cause. And from the God's eye point of view, everything is determinable.
Right. So to give a summary for our listeners, with early Stoics and Zeno, you start with people conceiving themselves as legitimate heirs to the Socratic tradition.
Right.
There's a lot of development on the theoretical side with the Middle Stoics. And the only text that we do have, full text at least, of Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius are all the later Stoics
Yes,
who have
that's
this
correct.
ethical, therapeutic bent.
That's correct.
So let's ask the central question that we're going to ask each of these three schools, which is, how do you become happy for the Stoics?
The good life is life in agreement with nature. Nature having two aspects to it. So nature in the round refers to the reality, the world. Understanding the way the world is structured is one facet of it. And then the other is your understanding your own nature. And it's really, so how do these two natures fit together, the inner and the outer? I think so one could say that you become happy, or ideally happy in Stoicism, if you can understand enough of the way things are. You can fulfill the reasonable desires. You can contribute to society, your family, and so forth. But at the same time, you're always able to step back. You're not just caught up in these states of affairs. You can always keep asking yourself, well, where am I at this moment? What is the appropriate thing for me to be doing at this time, both to achieve happiness for myself, but also for my society.
Right. To elaborate here, one of the defining features of Stoic ethics is this idea that virtue only, rather than external goods, is necessary for happiness.
Yes.
But then they make an equally perhaps puzzling move to say that, and there are preferred indifference, that there are certain goods that you nonetheless have reasons to pursue. What I want to do is to take a step back here and compare Stoicism to another school that seems drastically different, but actually shares a lot of the philosophical ideas, which is Cynicism. Because Cynicism is also, in my understanding, about virtue only bringing you to happiness, but then they don't make the second step to say that there are certain goods that you should pursue. So tell us a bit about the story of Cynicism and how it relates to with Stoicism.
Yes, good. The earliest influences on Zeno seem to have been through a Cynic philosopher called Crates. And the hallmark of cynicism, this kind of cynicism, is it's a kind of back to nature philosophy. Already 100 years earlier, the philosophers had begun to distinguish between what we might call nature and convention. So convention covering human rules, practices, customs on the one hand, but something underlying those, or perhaps not even underlying them, but which is more basic. You can change customs, but you can't change reality. And so nature covering reality, custom covering convention. And so the Cynics wanted to argue that a great deal of the things that are thought to be important in most people's lives are not natural in the sense that they're obligatory. Of course, everybody wants to avoid pain, everybody wants to have a pleasant life, everyone wants affection and so forth. Those things are natural. But a great deal of what we think of as the foundation of a good life, health, wealth, and so forth, let's say wealth, ambition, status, they're merely conventional goods. And so what the Cynics want to do is to strip away from their notion of a good life these inessential features. And so Cynics would compare human life to an animal's life. And in that sense, they might seem to be anti-rationalist. In fact, actually, Diogenes, the leading Cynic, said, give me reason or a rope. So he certainly wasn't anti-rationalist. But they do want to challenge the notion of conventional goods as being natural and therefore famous story of Diogenes telling Alexander the Great, "Oh, hey, step away! You
keep blocking my sun.
You're blocking the sun off me." And that story, again, is meant to sort of polarize the ideally successful person on the one hand, whereas Diogenes is the Cynic's successful man because he's been able to deal with exile and other misfortunes. And so this is then the embryo of Stoicism, putting the emphasis on the inner, inner rather than the outer. And I think Diogenes, of course, is obviously an entertainer as well. And I think that's an important aspect of these, the embryo of these philosophies. We'll see a bit of it with Pyrrho. We'll see it with Epicurus. The founders are charismatic people. They have big personalities. They're not
Zeno though, right?
Yes,
Zeno as well.
Yes, I mean he perhaps he wasn't flamboyant, but he got tremendous praise from Athens, and there were statues put up for him, and this goes on right through. People had little busts of Chrysippus in their houses. So I think that. I mean, it's true to some extent still today. I mean, philosophers are talking people. I mean, if you can't talk, you're not going to get very far as a philosopher. But to come back to the point about cynicism, so Zeno starts off as a cynic and a Socratic, but then what he then develops beyond the Socrates and the cynics is this whole kind of complex cosmology of determinism, theology, and the divine principle, which is, we could think of the divine principle as both something like energy. They call it fire, but it's also conscious. It's their name for the divine causation. Everything in a sense is a part of the divine. It's a pantheistic philosophy in that sense. And now this brings us again back to this sort of notion of being at home in the universe. We could say that every human being in Stoicism is it's like a cell. It's like a cell of this macrocosmic structure. So you're not isolated. An Epicurean is in a sense always atomized, whereas the Stoic is belonging, and a word that we've never come up with the right translation for it, oikeiosis, but it really it's derived from the name for a house, and so I talked about being at home in the world, and Stoicism says that look, we have instincts, which we then develop by reason into ways of belonging. And then just again, to give you a little example of this, lest I forget it, because a wonderful example is a later Stoic called Hierocles, whom we only know about through a papyrus, which was discovered about 100 years ago. And Hierocles says, think of yourself as the center of a series of concentric circles. Think of your mind and your body, and they're the center here. And then these circles go on right out to the outer parts of the human race. So you've got all these different sort of concentrics. And then start to bring the furthest circles inward, draw them into you. And then he suggests, well, you might, instead of talking about your neighbors, you might call them uncles and aunts. And it's a way then, and this is the unity of mankind aspect of Stoicism, which is again very, very important, and again we'll see in later just how different this is from Epicureanism, with putting sort of society at the center of the cosmos as well.
I see.
Okay.
So let's go back to the Cynics for a bit, because it sounds like Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, studied with the Cynics, and the Stoics, like the Cynics, agree virtue only leads to happiness, to abide by reason. Where they seem to differ is on how to relate to conventional goods.
Yes.
And here they go 180.
Yeah.
Whereas the Cynics say, everything conventional, not animalistic, not natural, we're going to reject. And then you lead to crazy stories of Diogenes like masturbating and defecating in public.
Yeah, right.
Whereas the Stoics, and this is a critique of the Stoics, I think, double down on the conventional goods. When you start reading the later Roman Stoics, like Seneca and Epictetus, you don't know if you're getting Stoic philosophy or good old Roman values.
Yeah.
So that seems to be the big divergence between the two schools. Is that right?
Yeah, but the basic notion is nature for Stoicism, what they call nature, is the foundation of value. So what does that mean? Well, think of it intuitively. It seems uncontroversial that we're better off not in pain. We're better off with shelter. We're better off with food. And so we can think of these things that we're better off with as natural to our species. But then at the same time, they want to draw a sharp distinction between that which we must have in order to flourish as human beings, which is our reason, and these what we might think of as preferables, but not, they're not essential. We can live on bread and water for a while.
Right. We can live in pain. We can live without money, without honor.
And we not only can we live, but we can also flourish at the level of reason. And as you know, has been proven with countless examples in history. The Orthodox Stoic view is that, of course, we should do everything in our power to be safe, to promote the well-being of our families. We don't go after virtue. Virtue is not something to go. You can go after money. You can go after good food. You can't go after virtue because virtue is a state of the mind. But virtue needs material to work with, and so the Stoics will say things like, other things being equal, of course, we should try to be prosperous and so on.
Right.
But we don't regard them as unconditional, unconditionally desirable.
Right.
But they are certainly, if you ignored them, you wouldn't be able to live a natural life.
Right.
But the cynics, as far as we can tell, don't want to make that distinction between within nature. The notion that certain things are preferable by objectively, I think they want to reject that. But then what seems to happen is that cynicism dies out. Stoicism takes over until we get to around the time of Epictetus, when cynicism revives in the Roman Empire. And we may want to talk about that when we come to talk about Epictetus. But it's a very interesting question. We don't quite know what caused the revival. We do know that Epictetus is very firm about not sort of thinking that you can be a good cynic by sort of going around naked and doing all kinds of scandalous things.
Right.
It's again, he calls the cynic a kind of evangelist for Stoicism.
I hope this raises a lot of interesting questions in our audience's mind, because we're going to have a whole other 2-hour-long interview just to discuss this topic with Epictetus, as well as his relationship with the Cynics. Let's unpack all this in the Epictetus interview. Now I want to move on to the second school, the Epicureans. So tell us about the history of this school.
Yeah, so Epicurus was an Athenian and contemporary of Zeno, sort of one generation, maybe more than one generation younger than Aristotle. And he encountered the atomism, the atomistic theories of Democritus. Democritus, an earlier Greek philosopher. It's the theory that the building blocks of the universe are little inanimate blobs of impenetrable matter, uncreated, they're just there. They naturally move around, coming into contact with one another, and depending on their shapes and impacts, forming composite objects, and gradually, so you build up the world through these contacts between impenetrable atoms. There's no purpose. There's no divinity in doing any of this. This is just the way things are. So in that sense, the world, and in fact there are infinite many worlds, is simply an accidental occurrence as a result of atomistic physics. That's the foundation of the Epicurean world. And so what it does is it removes divine control. It removes teleology, and so we're then left with big questions like, well, how come that there's all this the apparent order? Why does the sun rise every day? Why are living things with all their complexity? And the Epicureans have to come up with that. But they are the kind of predecessors of modern physics in this way. We're still stuck with this problem. The Epicureans are stuck with that too. They don't. Life for them is an emergent property.
Right.
It doesn't. Whereas the Stoics are going to make life a primitive property.
I see.
Which is going to be very interesting.
Right. So one takes a like a organic view of the universe, and
Yes.
one takes like a Newtonian billiard ball deterministic view.
Exactly.
So before we dive into the Epicurean worldview, which is fascinating, let's talk about their prescription for happiness, which is pleasure. How do they define pleasure, and what falls into their category of pleasure?
So, well, they say that the two primary values for the Epicurean are pleasure and the absence of pain. There are no non-physical entities in the Epicurean universe, but they still distinguish, as we do in everyday life, between the mind and the body. And so they think that it's just natural for us to desire to avoid pain. It's natural for us to pursue pleasure. And these are pleasures both of the bodily kind and of the mental kind.
And so they do recognize things like contemplation.
Oh, yes. And they think that the mental pleasures are much truer pleasures than bodily pleasures. I mean, the Epicureans really are the progenitors of utilitarianism. Bentham and Mill were. Bentham says, he almost quotes Epicurus exactly. Without pleasure and pain, you can't imagine any change of value. But what they're primarily concerned with, and I touched on this before, is freedom from anxiety, tranquility. And so the fear of the gods, fear of divine intervention, fear of death, these are the two, these are two great fears of the Epicureans. And so a lot of their philosophy is designed to try and counter those fears. The arguments against the fear of death are very powerful arguments. They're wonderfully chanted in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. When we exist, death is not there, and when death is there, we're not there. And so there's nothing there for us to be afraid of, because it faces head on the notion that we're just annihilated.
Right,
we don't exist.
Right. There's no one to fear anything after death.
No,
right.
Because that's going to give us a, but that's a kind of different fear.
Right.
So the fear of being dead is a different fear from fearing death in anticipation.
Right.
Then the other fear is then that you will be in need, and so this is where the Epicureans develop their very powerful theories of the simple life, which tries to strip desires down to the minimum, and avoid politics, avoid the rat race, live simply, because again, the more simply you live, the less you're going to be in want and feel you're missing out. So this again makes the Epicurean life very different from what we think of as an epicure.
Right, a hedonistic life. It's very different from hedonistic. It's more about desire limiting than it is about
limiting. Limit is very important. Absolutely, right. Yeah.
So let's take a step back, because I want to examine this normative pole of pleasure. Let me give you a quote from your book. "The goodness of pleasure needed no demonstration. Epicurus takes it as an obvious fact that men, like all living things, pursue pleasure and avoid pain. The attractiveness of pleasure is treated as an immediate datum of experience comparable to the feeling that fire is hot." Two questions of using this type of argument to establish that pleasure is something we ought to pursue. The first problem is an empirical one. There seem to be people, whether it's ascetics or it's masochists, who don't derive pleasure from their pain, but they derive another kind of satisfaction from their pain. So that's the empirical just objection. Like not everyone seems to desire pleasure and run away from pain. But even if we grant the Epicureans this, there's a second problem, which is that, is this not the naturalistic fallacy? Why is the fact that we do desire pleasure enough to say that we ought to chase after pleasure? They
do fall foul of, I mean, if you think the naturalistic fallacy is a valid, objection, G. Moore's point, because something is desired doesn't make it desirable, right? I think that's fair. I don't know to what extent Epicurus was alive to the notion of a kind of pathological masochism. But he might think that even if my own sensations are not the only criterion for value, the masochist is still going to be in the minority. And
so they're just wrong. If you were forced to say something about,
you might, yes, or that yes. I mean that statistically, he's in fairly good grounds in thinking that pleasure is desirable and pain is to be avoided. But I think once you see what the contents of those pleasures and pains are, then it becomes a more sophisticated theory. It isn't just about pleasurable sensations. He does, I mean, I think he likes to shock a bit. He does say he can't imagine what a good life would be if he, independently of a full stomach and things of that way. But then he comes up with this wonderful saying, which is presumably autobiographical, where he says, at the moment, the pain in my stomach is more intense than it's ever been. He's actually at the end of his life. But the pleasure of our conversations and the memories of our times together is enough to counterbalance that. It's a beautiful saying.
Oh, memory. So yes, the pleasures of memories.
Yes, pleasures of memory. Pleasure of memory and anticipation. So memories and anticipations can fill out the present. So it's an interesting notion there that we're not in any way limited.
Right. To what actually is right here. Right.
And there was a rival school of hedonists called the Cyrenaics, and they do seem to restrict pleasure just to sensation, whereas Epicurus does not.
I see. And the point you bring that up is that suddenly it becoms a much more sophisticated theory that you have to take seriously, right?
It does.
So I want to introduce another part of the theory that I think can better explain why it's about desire limiting. And that is that there are static and kinetic pleasures, right? That he believes that by default, the human condition is quite pleasurable. Yes. And that's the static pleasure of satiety.
Yes.
However, when you eat food before you become satiated, that's the kinetic pleasure. But the issue with kinetic pleasures is, one, they're ephemeral, and two, there's always some pain associated. Like for me to feel joy about eating, I have to be hungry, right?
Well, I think the notion there is that desire, in some sense, is a lack. I mean, you might have had, a wonderful meal at a world-famous restaurant, Chez Panisse in Berkeley, $400 meal. But once your stomach is full, you're not going to get very far by just saying, oh, that meal was so wonderful. You could think that for a bit, but after a while, that's it. So I think the notion then that in order to keep your pleasure kind of index to the maximum, you need to be varying your experience. I mean, if what you're particularly interested in is in the pleasures of sensation, well, you've had the good meal, but now you want
it's time to read
Now the question of kinetic and static. So the static pleasure, the idea is that once you've removed the pain of want, you've satisfied that desire, then you're in a kind of equilibrium at that point. You reach a kind of point at which it would be painful to go on. If you're actually positively painful. But what you will be able to do then, even though you have no sensual needs, you're feeling replete in every way. But then there's the question of what you're doing, and so the enjoyment of something whether it's reading or conversation, these would be kinetic pleasures, which would not be. They wouldn't be fulfilling a want. I mean,
right.
I mean, you might be desperate to read this book, but
it's different from hunger.
It's a very different set kind of thing. Yes.
So there is no pain. No. It's a kinetic pleasure. Yes. I see. So I was wrong. Not all kinetic pleasures are about the removal of pain.
Other kinetic pleasures are simply varying the static pleasures of the time being.
I see. The part where I think Epicureanism gets really difficult is how it relates to sociality, with friendships and with justice and the state. My understanding is that the Epicureans advise people to enter into friendships, not because friendship itself is directly pleasurable, as you seem to suggest, but it's because your friends can help you secure other pleasures. Like it's like a safety net. And that's how atomistic they are. Is that a good understanding? Or is there something about friendship and good conversation, as you say, that is in and of itself a pleasure?
No, you're right. They do want to say that the starting point of friendships and social intercourse is security. You make friends not just because you are naturally philanthropic or something like that. It's a very utilitarian kind of notion of friendship. Your friends are useful to you. But then they want to say that friendships can then become, as it were, are good in themselves. So independent.
A pleasure in themselves.
Yeah, a pleasure in themselves. Yes.
I see.
Yes.
So independent of whether Professor Long actually helps me do X, Y, Z.
Yes.
Just the companionship, they do recognize that as a legitimate pleasure.
Yes. And Mill says something very much like that in his account of utilitarianism.
Right. So you described the Epicureans as proto-social contract theorists.
Yes.
And it's kind of extending this intuition to the political state.
Yes.
The first reason you enter a political state is because of how it can help you secure your more base sort of pleasures and avoid the baser pains.
Right.
But then they should say, like they say for friendship, that citizenship itself can be a pleasure, right? Or do they not say that?
I don't know if they say that exactly. I mean, they want to be fairly parsimonious about their bottom lines. You know, they want to be fairly rigorously empiricist. They don't want, to have people saying, "Oh, you're bringing in some unjustified assumption here." So they can argue that society originates out of our needs for security, rather than that we're naturally altruistic or philanthropic. I think that's what they would want to say.
I see. And they can see sociality as a legitimate pleasure, even if not the participation in political life, for example.
It's interesting. Right? Interesting here is Lucretius has a very, very interesting account of kind of almost like an evolutionary theory of society, where he argues that the earliest human beings, a bit like kind of Hobbesian kind of notion of, were rather brutish, men and women just kind of mingled and went around, but then as they formed families, then Lucretius says the nature softened, which is rather interesting. Human society can evolve in certain ways,
right?
Even if it's not there, sort of implicit in the
base source code of human nature.
Right, yeah.
And so is the Epicurean about getting rid of all desires that we can possibly get rid of, and just only, there's only food and shelter and maybe basic friendship left, so that you're never troubled by desires not being satisfied? Or is that too minimalist a view?
They have a fairly complicated taxonomy of desires. I mean, so they distinguish between necessary desires, like for food and sex, and desires which are natural but not necessary. Perfectly natural to prefer, a nice steak to a rotten piece of meat, and unnecessary. And so the unnecessary desires are the ones that are going to generate more pain than pleasure if they're fulfilled, and they're simply not. They have no bearing on your overall happiness. The specification for happiness is primarily seen in terms of freedom from fear and tranquility, removal there. Yeah.
I see. I want to now go back to one of the big sources of fear, which is the afterlife.
Yes.
So the Epicureans thought that one of the main reasons that they can help others resolve fear and establish tranquility is to suggest that the gods do not intervene in human affairs.
Yes.
And this is interesting, I think, because when people look at Christians today, I think the common intuition is to say, well, religion has made their lives so much happier, even if I can't believe that. Mm-hmm. But Epicurus wants to say something different, which is, look at the fear that people who believe in divine punishment, eternal punishment, have. And this is true in history, right? If you look at the historical Christians, they're often like Calvin or people like Luther.
Yeah.
This is the primary existential question that bothers them day to day. That, I think, is understandable, right? If you believe in a Zeus or a god giving you divine, eternal punishment, why that would give you tranquility. But then I give you a quote from your book. Epicurus can't have taken popular superstitions as his only target. He was also concerned to reject the sophisticated theology of Plato and probably Aristotle too.
Yes.
When it comes to theologies that doesn't have this Zeus, God giving you eternal divine punishment, what's wrong with those theologies?
They're idle superstition. There's no empirical basis for thinking that there's, say, such a thing as Aristotle's unmoved mover. I mean, it's tempting to think that Epicurus was a virtual atheist, but he's not. His primary reason for saying there are gods is consensus omnium, that he doesn't know of any society which has no theological beliefs. But the interesting thing is that he thinks that there are gods, and he then proposes that they must be models of happiness. A god for Epicurus is an immortal being which suffers no disruptions at all. So they are models of beatitude, and he does think that they can be useful for human beings to contemplate.
As models.
Yes.
Right. Not as helpers.
No. Epicurus was a strikingly handsome figure. We have many examples of statues of Epicurus. Here's this extraordinarily handsome, sort of dignified, wonderful-looking human god that people would contemplate, look at, and they would, and according to Epicurean theory of vision and perception, atoms from the god's body would enter your mind, and you would assimilate. And it's a lovely theory. Whether it's correct or not, there's no doubt at all that Epicurus was seen as a kind of
right,
as a divinely beautiful being. And so the Epicureans they come up with what sounds like a paradox. They believe that the soul is mortal, but they believe that but they also believe that you can be equal to the gods in happiness.
So going back to their response to Plato and Aristotle, it seems like they say it's not true, or this Aristotle's first mover, Plato's forms. Does truth have an independent value from pleasure? What I'm trying to ask is, do the Epicureans think it's okay to give a noble lie? And let me give you an example. Stoic cosmology, for example, is very positive. There is a providential deity, and this is the best of all possible worlds.
Right.
In fact, it's the exact worldview that allows Marcus Aurelius to look at his dead child and think that there's something positive here.
Yeah.
So would an Epicurean have an issue with someone who believes in the Stoic theology of this intervening logos, so to speak, intervening God, even if they don't think it's true, but if it gives them pleasure?
Interesting question. Does truth itself, getting the facts right, have a value for the Epicurean, or is it only a value if it's
pleasurable?
Pleasurable, gives tranquility. It's a good question. I don't think that there's very good reason for thinking the Epicureans would say that truths, just because they're truths, are to be sought after, yes. On the other hand, living in error, I don't think would seem appropriate either, because it seems as if living in error could very rapidly develop into some kind of painful.
Can I suggest a resolution, perhaps?
Yeah.
Maybe it's something like truth doesn't have an independent value to pleasure,
right?
But the assumption is simply, if you understand the true nature of the world, it will bring pleasure. So maybe they join falsehood with pain in some sense, and pleasure with truth. Is that?
Yes, I'd like to think that. I think because that would seem an Enlightenment sort of notion, but I'm not quite sure they would be quite as strong about its
alignment, right?
Here's a reason why I question this. One of the interesting things they talk about is how to understand distant phenomena, like say eclipses. Okay, the theory of multiple explanation. Accept all. It'll be true that only one explanation is actually actual, but you accept all three when you have no reason to reject any one of them. You'd think one might want to say, well, let's press on. Let's look at those clearly. Are they equally about? And so that's what they do, and it suggests that they're not really interested in the ultimate facts here.
Right. They're kind of pragmatists, almost.
It is a pragmatic view. There wouldn't be a basis for saying, well, knowledge for its own sake,
right,
is to be sought for.
I see.
Yeah,
I do find it striking how closely Epicurean assumptions, even if not marketed as such, are alive and well today in society.
Yes.
Whether it's the hedonism, right? Whether it's the atomism, the metaphysics, whether it's the empiricism.
Yes.
However, when we talk about today, or at least when you ask a specific type of religious person today, what is the cause of much of mental pain?
Yes.
It is atheism, right? It is this kind of meaningless, nihilistic worldview of humans are just atoms roaming around in this universe, this big cosmic soup.
Yes.
Were the Epicureans ever worried that their metaphysical worldview would actually be a source of pain?
I think I'm more of a natural Epicurean than I am a Stoic. And the notion that we are alone in the universe doesn't bother me. I think what my response to that is make the best of what you've got now. But I think what is interesting in the way you raise the question is why is Epicureanism, why is Stoicism so popular today? And why aren't people? I mean, I find students are very impressed with Epicurus, Lucretius. Right. And I haven't encountered a student who's been particularly bothered about the virtual atheism.
Let's turn to the final school, the Skeptics.
Yes.
And let's start with the Pyrrhonian Skeptics first. So tell us a bit about the history of the school.
Pyrrho himself is a fascinating figure. We don't know much about him, but we do know that he supposedly went on to India with Alexander, because it's one of the few cases where Eastern philosophy and religion may have impacted Greeks. He is supposed to have hung out with, they were called the naked philosophers on the Ganges, and Brahmins, or perhaps some such people. Pyrrho was famous for his imperturbability, for his extraordinary ability to sort of...
Resilience,
right? But even more than just resilience. I mean, he'd been a storm at sea and he wouldn't flinch at all. And so this is supposedly something he might have learned from India. But anyway, but Pyrrho, to come back to his sort of philosophy, it's the notion that truth is in the depths, truth is unattainable. So we shouldn't ever make judgments about things that we have no basis for saying. Empiricism later develops. It becomes a philosophy of describing the surface of things and not trying to go into what are called the unseen. So atomism would be right out. Stoic cosmology would be right out, because those are they're just
metaphysics, describing things in themselves.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
So Stoics rely on reason.
Yes.
The Epicureans rely on empiricism.
Yes.
What arguments did Pyrrhonists have to reject both of these modes of knowing?
They developed a very elaborate series of what are called modes. And they are the modes to induce suspension of judgment. Whenever people come up with any kind of theory of something, and even it could be a general, say an empirical generalization, people sweat in the sun. No, says Pyrrho, that's not universally true. Alexander's butler, he shivered in the sun. he sweated in the cold. And so you come up with examples to challenge these empirical generalizations. You look at you say, look at the cat's eyes. How you think you're seeing things as they are? How would the spider look at it? So you challenge naive empiricism, and by saying everything is always from a point of view, always from a perspective. We can't get at any ungrounded arguments.
What about phenomenon that Epicureans can't give counterexamples? Like, for example, Newton's laws, right? Like every action has an opposite and equal reaction. Like when it comes to things that seem to universally hold, what would they do?
Well, they would accept, I got that some of an even numbers are going to be even numbers, but they're not going to justify it. They're going to reject.
They do accept that. They do accept sum of two even numbers is even. I see.
But not attempt to justify it. I mean, just say, well, it looks like it has to be true, but they're not going to start to do Russell's principle of arithmetic or something to ground. So it's the absence of justification. And then I touched on and didn't yet explain properly this notion of suspension of judgment. So suspension of judgment becomes epoche is the Greek phrase for it. It becomes a kind of catchphrase. And again, it probably goes back in some sense in its origins to Socrates. The idea that the worst thing you can do is being deceived is worse than
than ignorance.
Ignorance, right? Yes. So you suspend judgment in order to avoid error, and that's what the modes are systems of argument to induce suspension of judgment.
And they think that all judgments can be suspended with their arguments, or only a subset.
No, the Epicureanist is not going to say that when he puts his hands out onto the fire, it doesn't feel warm. They're going to accept sensations, but they're not going to explain why, how this happens. Not going to. So the whole range of theories is going to be discarded.
So it sounds like the target of suspension is really any statement on the unseen, or like on anything other than direct sense perception, right? Like, I see.
And where they link up with the other two philosophies we've been discussing, in some sense here, is that the upshot of suspension of judgment is supposed to be tranquility. That the more you worry about how things are under the surface or which theory is true, is going to be troubling.
Before we talk about that ethical conclusion, which I think is the most fascinating part of Epicureanism, I want to give you a quote from your book. What skeptics try to show is that truth is impossible, talking about the unseen, owing to the equal weight of arguments on both sides. What gets me there is equal.
Yes.
Because surely I don't know if this is really an iPad.
Yes.
But do I really have equal arguments to think that this is actually a cat?
Yes. If they're not equipollent, then you're pushing in one direction rather than another. And as the Epicureanist, you will go on then looking for arguments to try to get the equipollence.
I see.
You'll look for more examples of Alexander's butler and so on. Yes.
I see. So they would try to show me that this is equally likely to be a cat as an iPad.
And so when you read Sextus Empiricus, who is the ancient author we have the most detail of, I mean, there's a whole battery of arguments there. And of course, they can't be exhaustive. But they give you, as a Epicureanist, they give you the tools to try and to do this.
Right. Could you give another example other than the Alexander's butler?
Well, I mean, that Alexander's butler doesn't come up. That doesn't give you equipollence.
Right.
That only gives you reason to doubt.
To doubt, yeah.
But I think, the equipollence, I think, would come up where you're dealing with a very strong theoretical claim. I'd say that the world has an ordered structure, the Stoic view, or the Epicurean saying it doesn't.
Right.
And there you can see, how you could go either way.
I see. But if one wants to claim that the world is, right, like that to me, it seems so hard, because that's a metaphysical claim, right?
Yeah.
It seems so hard to me to give an equipollent argument on both sides, that the world is and is not is as likely.
take the way the Epicureans reject. I mean, Stoics' argument for design, and look how beautiful the sun rises every day.
Right.
The birds are singing, and the Epicureans say yes, and look at the earthquakes and the storms and
Right.
the malformations.
Right. Arguing against
Yes.
divine providence.
Yes.
Right. It sounds like the equipollence is really targeted at deep metaphysical claims.
Yes. The Puritists often talk about a life without belief is the ideal life. And because that sounds implausible. I mean, can you get rid of all beliefs?
Right.
And so do they mean by that only beliefs about non-evident phenomena? Or do they mean everyday beliefs? And I think it must be about the non-evident phenomena.
I see.
Because Pyrrho was able to live a perfectly satisfactory life, even though, well, there are some nice stories. Some people said he would have sort of
Fallen off a cliff.
Yes, if his friends hadn't helped him. Yes.
Right. Because for him, this could be a cliff and this could be not a cliff. But you're actively rejecting that reading. You're saying the conventional world is protected from this.
Yes.
You can still talk about sense perception. It's really philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It's like Wittgensteinian, like they're trying to end philosophy, essentially.
And of course, a lot of what's going on in Sextus Empiricus and must have been going on in Pyrrhonism is arguing against other philosophers. All the schools are in turn demolished by the Pyrrhonists.
Right, I see.
Because they're a threat to suspension of judgment.
But then I have almost the exact opposite concern, which is, what if they're not skeptical enough? And maybe I can bring in someone like Descartes here on my side and say,
the demon.
The demon. Mm-hmm. Why do you trust convention? Why do you, if you're doubting such a fundamental metaphysical questions, why trust your sense perceptions? And this becomes even more difficult because it seems like you can't even formulate thoughts even about the immediate sense perception, because the formulation of thoughts in a sentence is temporal.
Yes.
So the demon could have tricked me in the last millisecond to believe in something that I didn't before. And so why don't they problematize that?
Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, what about language? Doesn't language presuppose all kinds of judgments? In the end, that the response to that is probably that Pyrrhonism is in the end an ethical philosophy rather than a theoretical. I mean, it is to induce tranquility.
I see.
And I mean, sometimes Sextus Empiricus will seem a little bit kind of cavalier. He'll say things, well, if the claim that you're opposing is a bit of a weak claim, well, a weak counter argument will do. It doesn't have to be an absolutely cogent argument. So I think that's the way they would probably deal with the evil demon kind of objection.
And this is where, again, I want to highlight the idea that ethics is first philosophy for all of these schools. Yes. And this is how it's different from modern skepticism.
Oh, yes.
Where modern skepticism is merely about the realm of ideas, right? Whereas here, it's all, the goal is to liberate you. And I would like to give you a quote from your book. The starting point of skepticism is the hope of attaining freedom from disturbance. Mm-hmm. We are to suppose that this motive led certain men to search for a criterion by reference to which truth and falsity might be established. They failed in this quest, but achieved their long-term aim, discovering freedom from disturbance as if by chance, as a consequence of suspending judgment.
Yeah, Sextus Empiricus compared it to a famous painter, and he couldn't capture something that he was trying to capture. I think it was the hairstyle of the figure he was painting, and he threw his brush at the canvas. And lo and behold, he got this wonderful coiffure there. And so this was this idea that it was not that they intended.
Right. They stumbled into it.
They stumbled on it. No, they found it worked for them. Yes.
Now, unfortunately, for us philosophers, they can't theorize about why that is, right? They can only say, well, it's worked for me.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
And that's it, right? Do they say anything more about why this happens, about why the suspension of belief creates this tranquility?
No, well, I think you could come up with a theorem. Some beliefs are troubling. Troubling beliefs are inimical to our happiness. They can, but then if the grounds for those beliefs are fragile, so you can develop an argument, I think, to show why. It's a very helpful philosophy in many ways. I think we we today, I think particularly, don't you think we need vast doses of skepticism? I mean,
right. I see.
I mean the way sound bites are trotted around.
Right.
Yeah, I think yeah.
What I find fascinating when we apply it to the insight about Epicureanism, that the very things that they think would bring happiness, like atomism,
Yes.
like this, like the fact that there are no gods,
Yes.
is what they think is what a lot of people today thinks bring pain. There's a similar kind of isomorphism here
There is.
with skepticism. Most people today think doubt is creates the conditions for pain of some sort, right? Mental disturbance of not being sure.
Yes,
And so
yes.
it's so interesting how the exact things
Yes.
that the ancients thought would
Yes.
bring happiness,
Yes.
today we think
Yes.
brings
That's very-
dissatisfaction.
That's very interesting. Yes, that is true. I think that's right. And of course, we haven't touched on another version of ancient skepticism,
Yes.
which we call academic skepticism.
Let's talk about that. Yes, give us a history.
Yes. So academic means here
Plato.
Plato's academy. And so after Plato's death, his school sort of continued with other followers, but sort of got into a bit of a kind of mess. There, Plato's metaphysics sort of became very scholastic, and a little bit after Epicurus, the leading academic sort of seemed to say, well, I think we're losing all this metaphysics and sort of theoretical stuff, a bit like scholasticism, is losing the kind of Socratic impetus of, trying to understand the best way to live. He then turned the academy away from metaphysics into a critical school, a school which really spent most of its time attacking Stoicism as a kind of dogmatism that wasn't justified. And so the slogan of academic skepticism was to suspend judgment about everything. And so this academic skepticism, which went on for a couple of generations, is different from Pyrrhonism. It didn't develop the theory, the notion of modes. And it didn't have an ethical basis in the same way. It was primarily, I think, a critique of the other schools.
A deconstruction, yes.
Yes, you could call it. That's a good way to put it. Arguing both sides of the question as a means of inducing suspension of judgment. So again, the equipollence would come in there.
But the academic skeptics, if I understand your book correctly, do want to make more claims than the Pyrrhonists in the sense that they have this theory of probabilism,
yes.
right?
Yes.
That good enough is good enough.
Yes. It's probabilism, not, I think, in the modern statistical sense, because the statistics didn't really exist in this sense yet, but it's certain claims are more persuasive than others. Now, but they're persuasive at the subjective level. It doesn't mean that they are probative at some,
metaphysical thing,
right.
Yes. Although the key difference I understand between the Pyrrhonists and the academic skeptics seems to be that the academics use argument from both sides to try to get at some truth, or to try to get at some probable truth.
Yes.
Whereas the Pyrrhonists use it to suspend judgment.
Yes.
Is that right? Is that a good distinction?
Well, the Pyrrhonists prefer their own version of suspension of judgment, because they say that truth is possible. We just haven't got access to it. Whereas they claim that the academics didn't say that truth is indiscoverable.
The critique is the reverse.
Yes.
It's the Pyrrhonist who thinks that truth is possible. They just haven't discovered it.
Yes.
I see. So the idea is this. The Pyrrhonist, every time he sees a metaphysical argument, tries to do equivalence, tries to set up, and they succeed. So they haven't discovered it yet.
No, but they keep trying. I think that's the claim is. I mean, whether they are really doing that, but they claim that it's possible. Whereas the academics, they accuse the academics of being what they call negative dogmatists.
I see.
Denying that truth is even possible.
Right. Because that is a strong dogma, right?
Yeah.
I see. But the academics, is it right to think that the argument from both sides of the academics is a bit more practical or optimistic than the Pyrrhonist equivalence? Because the reason I say this is I'm reading a lot of Cicero right now. And Cicero is an academic skeptic. And he often uses the argument from both sides not to suspend his belief, but try to see what is the best view to act upon at the time.
No, you're right. He's a moderate academic skeptic. We tend to call him a probabilist. But the so-called probabilism or persuasive aspect is brought in as a kind of, because then the argument against the negative dogmatist is you can't live. You have to prefer one course of action to another.
So it sounds like the academic skeptics had two periods, right?
Yes,
one was this earlier, the negative dogmatists, as the Puranists called them, and then the probabilists, and this is the Ciceros.
And then it dies out. And Epictetus is very, very hard on the negative dogmatists and academic skeptics. He doesn't talk about Puranists, but he thinks that academic skepticism is just totally rejecting basic human nature.
I see.
Yes.
So we talked about these three major schools. Can you give us a brief history of what happens to Hellenistic philosophy after this heyday period?
Yeah. So we got this heyday period down to the time of Cicero, where it's still, new ideas and strategies are developing. And then what seems to happen is that for political reasons, Athens is loses its schools. The Epicurean school closes down, and Stoicism is being taught outside Athens. And then as we get into the beginning of the Roman Empire, there isn't any new
developments,
new development of coming up, and so in the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, are sort of people are still they're practicing Stoicism, they're practicing Epicureanism. Pyrrhonism is perhaps the nearest thing to it. And then nobody really quite understands why these schools start to lose their vitality. One explanation is the emergence of Christianity coming. Another, I think, is that whereas neither Stoicism nor Epicureanism had any interest in the sort of afterlife or, the kind of numinous or spirituality, put it whatever you want to put it, Platonism, that kind of Platonism became fashionable. A kind of more religious kind of philosophy, and so that then takes us into what the later period of ancient his philosophy is, with Neoplatonism, and that's really the end of Hellenistic philosophy as a creative set of movements. And so it had a long run. Yeah.
I see. However, in your book, you mentioned that it had a renaissance in the Renaissance itself, right? And then a lot of modernity is based off of it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think what I find most appealing about Hellenistic philosophy is this idea that ethics is first philosophy. So even though, like we said multiple times in this interview, it's wrong to assume it's only ethics, the fact is that ethics is first philosophy, meaning that metaphysics, logics, and linguistics are justified on ethics. So ethics is a starting point.
Yes.
The other thing about its ethics I find incredibly attractive compared to modern ethics is that it evaluates a life based on the character produced over the whole narrative of the life.
Absolutely.
And not, as Kant or the utilitarians do, on individual acts. Why did philosophy change in these two ways?
Yeah. Well, they all accept that the people who will try to practice them have their own individual natures. So they all have their own individual propensities. So to generalize about how one should behave in a way that, say, a utilitarian would, is not what they're trying to do.
I see. In other words, they preserve the individuality, the uniqueness of the individual a lot more because, and this is why, for example, people think Stoic ethics or Epicureanism to be so unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't tell you exactly what you can and cannot do because people are so different.
Right. Epictetus has these lovely little hokey examples. He says at one point, if you're Agamemnon, you go and lead the host. If you're Thersites, then you make bad jokes, you know. So, but
see.
there's equally appropriate ways to behave according to your nature.
Another thing I find very fascinating about Hellenistic philosophy compared to our modern times is that there seems to be periods in philosophy where even original thinkers try to disguise themselves as part of a school. And there are other times, and this is, I think, the era we're in with Kant and Hegel and certainly the French, where even somewhat derivative thinkers try to stand out and make a name for themselves. Why is there these two different modes of doing philosophy, of the individual thinker versus the school-based, as we see in Hellenistic philosophy? Because there were significant innovations in Hellenistic philosophy, even within the schools, right? Within Stoicism, within Skepticism, but they all packaged it as I am just a skeptic or I am just a Stoic.
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, I think the notion of a school presupposes a founder, an originator. Just why that should be so is an interesting question. I mean, you could say, well, of course, Plato founded his school, Aristotle founded his school, so that
was the trend of the day.
That's the way. But I think a more interesting point is why do the schools nonetheless cherish their own individual identity? I mean, there was, eclecticism. They jealously maintained their own autonomy. So even though, as we've been saying, they have a lot of points in common, they don't acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Well, I should qualify that. I mean, Seneca's a good example of not a professional philosopher, but a very learned and devoted practitioner of Stoicism. But he does give a lot of credit to Epicurus.
Right.
But in general, no, this notion of school boundaries is and again, we don't have anything quite like that today, I think.
It's very much thinker-based or subject-based or topic-based. I mean, there's another way to look at it. These three Hellenistic schools that I found to be interesting, if not right, is almost like the religion of Socrates. And what I mean by that is each of them traces Socrates as, in some sense, their original founder, right?
Yes.
The Stoics take his discussions on virtue. The Skeptics take his ignorance.
Yes.
Even the Epicureans take his reasons about his prudential reasoning about pain and pleasure as some kind of inspiration.
Yes.
And now, kind of like Buddhism, they all share this idea of eudaimonia too. So it's almost like they're this religion of Socrates. Like, is that a good way to look at it?
No, I think that I like that, and I think a lot. More could be done on teasing out these commonalities than has been. I think we've tended to follow the ancient way of sort of thinking of them rather.
So you spent your entire career dedicated to Hellenistic philosophy. Did you treat it as an academic puzzle to be solved, or were you pulled by these ethical questions in your own life?
My first project, actually, which I did my PhD on, was a book on Sophocles, the dramatist. But it was always clear to me that I wanted to work on philosophy, ancient philosophy. My initial inclination was entirely intellectual curiosity. In fact, in those days, I mean, we're talking about sort of 1960s in England, the idea of anybody doing philosophy as a way of life would have been laughed to scorn. I mean,
that's very sad, is it not, Professor?
It is sad, but that's the way it was, I think. How should I put it? It would have been seen as a kind of Victorian...
gentleman, scholar, dilettante.
Yes, and philosophy
not
was
serious.
Philosophy was Wittgenstein and Ryle, and philosophy as a way of life. It just didn't exist in England. I mean, so when I started, what prompted me was my main teacher, David Furley, and I said to him, what might I work on? And he said, I think the most neglected field of ancient Greek philosophy is Stoicism. I mean, we don't have most ancient Stoic texts, not the early ones. I mean, we had the Roman Stoics. But if you wanted to learn about the theory of Stoicism, you had to work with all these, what we call fragments, little bits and pieces and quotations. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. And I liked that. So the puzzle aspect was very challenging to me. And at that stage, I didn't ever think of applying it to myself.
Right.
And I don't think, when did I ever start to think of it as something that I might apply? I think that's really, this is quite recent. I mean, it's not much more than the last 10 or 15 years. I mean, this revival of Stoicism in America.
Right.
And it's really in America it has revived.
Do you feel like your life has been changed in some fundamental way after being exposed to Hellenistic philosophy after a lifetime?
It must have been, I suppose. Yes, I mean, I think especially, I think it was Epictetus. When something was troubling me, or I was thinking about something I needed to make a decision about, I would sort of say to myself, what would Epictetus say?
Right.
But I think that in many ways my natural sympathies, inclinations are Epicureanism, but as an intellectual construction, Stoicism has fascinated. Sometimes people have asked me, as you did in a sense, which of these philosophies do I
subscribe to?
And I sometimes said, well, in the morning when I teach, I'm a skeptic. In the afternoon, when I'm sort of relaxing, I'm an Epicurean. And when I want to mortify myself, I'm a Stoic.
I see. Well, thank you, Professor. Thanks for a fascinating interview. Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to my lectures. Now, if you like this interview, I filmed another with Professor Anthony Long on Epictetus, the Stoic Grandmaster, which I think you'll enjoy as well. You can find links to that interview and everything we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.